Hi, David. Thanks for coming on and talking with me today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here, Jake.
So, we're here to talk about your book, Life Part Two, which is a book on spiritual principles and practice for aging and the second part of life. Just for a little bit of background into you, in the book, you write about the spiritual impact of your father passing away when you were young, and you talked about in your 20s, you dove more deeply into spirituality. Can you talk a bit about your initial journey into spiritual practice and kind of how that's led up into this book and the work that you do now?
Sure. Well, as you just mentioned, when my father died suddenly from a heart attack when I was 13, there was a conversation I had with a rabbi who came on a condolence call that planted a seed in me in relation to what I understood spirituality to be. And it had to do with an exchange in which I said to this rabbi, who was a very kind man, um, why my father, right? And my thinking at the moment was there's all these rotten people out there in the world who, if anybody deserves to die, they do. And my father was a good person, generous and kind. Why my father? And the response I got, as I wrote about, was David's son, there are some things that God does that we just don't understand, right? Um, and that planted a seed that perhaps my intellect was not going to be sufficient for making sense out of this life in and of itself. As one spiritual teacher put it, the intellect is a great servant and a lousy master. We happen to live in a culture where we tend to sometimes make the intellect the master. Um, and so some years later, when I was in college, my junior year in college actually, um, like a lot of people my age, I was sowing oats with gusto, basically. Um, I was at Tulane University in New Orleans, which is known as a kind of a party and convention city. Um, I had explored, this was the late 60s, mid to late 60s, early 70s. So it was a wild time to be alive in certain ways in terms of what was going on culturally. And like a lot of young people my age, I thoroughly explored what alcohol and drugs were about and what partying was about. And I thought I got pretty good at partying, I would say, in certain ways. Um, and at the same time, um, I could see that the culture had sold me kind of a bad bill of goods because I was trying all of the things I got from our culture that said those things would make me happy. And I wasn't. Yeah. So on my 21st birthday, I was over a friend's house at his apartment and I saw a book on meditation and yoga. And I asked him if I could borrow it. And he said, sure, just bring it back when you're done. Yeah. Changed my life completely. Perhaps because I was ready, in a sense. I was somewhat depressed and anxious. Um, and I made a radical turnabout. And I started to teach myself hatha yoga. I started to train myself in meditation. I noticed that I started to feel better than I had in a long, long time. And my outlook on life started to brighten. So I was set on a course that I have stayed on since that time. And I'm 74 at this point. So that's quite a few years ago, basically. Yeah. Um, I found a yoga teacher, a wonderful man who came from India to New York named Swami Satchidananda. Came over to New York in about 66 and started a series of meditation centers and yoga centers throughout the country. And then trained as a yoga teacher after being inspired by what I saw going on in my own life, and began to deepen my meditation practice through my last couple of years of college and then in the years that followed. So um, that was a real turning point. And And I could sense even at the time that there was something about my father's death that did plant a seed, because life, I could see after a couple of years of meditation and looking inwardly at the nature of the heart and mind, and looking outwardly at what was sometimes a pretty chaotic and complicated world, I could see that there was something fundamentally and profoundly mysterious about what we're all doing here, even when our intellects try to convince us otherwise.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of how it got started for me.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on timing? It seems like with these kinds of things, with meditation, spiritual practice, it's like there's a certain time when it resonates and a certain time when it might just not be the right time yet. Like
Mm-hmm.
like where you might pick up the same book at two different points in your life and it takes on a completely different meaning. Because in some sense, like you talk about the intellect, these things are not they're not intellectual concepts. Like you can pick up a book about intellectual concepts and you get it like regardless. But these things,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be much more depending on your conditions and your context at the time in your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Quite so, I would say. Um, I think there's a kind of intuitive wisdom that's different from what we think of as intellectual activity. And I'm not anti-intellectual in any way,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's more a matter of um, recognizing that the intellect is wonderful with linear left brain related issues. Yeah. Um, at the same time, the intuitive heart or mind, in Buddhism, oftentimes the language for heart and mind is actually one word. So it's often translated as heart hyphen mind, rather than separating those the way we do in conventional Western culture. Yeah. And and I do think there is a process of ripening of a certain kind when certain causes and conditions are present, certain things unfold. Right. However, it's not primarily an act of will, which is something our culture also tells us plays a major role in our lives. Sometimes it's a matter of listening and being receptive, and then allowing something to unfold organically, rather than sort of having it be ego driven. I'm going to make this happen. Yeah. There's a classic Zen story about uh, a teacher and his student. Philip Kapleau Roshi was one of the first Zen teachers in America after being in a Japanese war camp during World War II. And as the story goes, one of his senior teachers came up to him and asked him um, about enlightenment. And he was kind of frustrated, the student, with his own meditation practice. Excuse me. And he said, so Roshi, which is an honorific, a title, right, for people who are unfamiliar with the term. So what is enlightenment anyway, right? And Kapleau responded to this man. He said, well, enlightenment is an accident, right? And that didn't help the student tremendously. He was a little nonplussed and frustrated. So he said, then, and the student said, so then why do we meditate, right? And Kapleau looked at this man and he said, because it makes you accident prone, right? So the notion here is that we can do certain things to set up the causes and conditions, right? Like you could plant a carrot seed. In order for that seed to grow into a healthy carrot, there needs to be good soil and the right amount of sunlight and a certain amount of moisture. And those are the causes and conditions that allow that seed to become a carrot that someone can find nourishment in, right? Um, and so the carrot seed knows what to do. You don't have to yell at it or stomp your foot on the ground or tell it what to do, right? But you do need to do your part to tend the garden so that it has the requisite causes and conditions to become, in this case, an enlightened being, basically. So timing is like that, is
Yeah.
listening for where are we in relation to these organic processes that sometimes the ego tries to co-opt,
Mhm.
basically. And this is where your contemplative practices like meditation and contemplative prayer and other inner developmental practices, those are designed to help us listen inwardly to what the heart is whispering to us about what we need to do to create the causes and conditions
Yeah.
that will allow us to come to full fruition as human beings.
So these practices aren't you like making the thing happen. It's you're setting up an environment in a way to kind of let the thing come of itself when it's ready to come.
Exactly. And then you learn to trust the process in the sense that it's not your business, so to speak, when it's going to happen, right? This is a little bit of the leap of faith in a committed spiritual practice. Because if you try too hard for the result, rather than just taking it moment to moment, you end up with what in Zen they call a gaining attitude.
Yeah.
And ironically, what you can end up doing unknowingly is to reinforce the very ego structure that spiritual practices are designed to dissolve your identification with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Plus, you can begin to strive and over effort in a way that leads more to suffering than to happiness and well being. Right. Especially if it's reinforced by feelings of low self esteem, which are somewhat endemic in our culture.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then it becomes a self improvement project rather than a natural unfolding.
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up playing sports, and that was kind of the culture and the approach
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
that that kind of like goal oriented nature of just like better, 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 and it's just kind of
Yep.
like a hamster wheel never stops. So I've had a hard time with that, like kind of easing off the gas, and anything that I do, like that's kind of immediately what I snap to. Is that something
Mm-hmm.
that you struggled with when you first started with the meditation and hatha yoga? Like did you have a hard time like just kind of letting it happen and having a little bit more patience to balance out, I guess, ambition in a sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was also very athletic as a kid. Um, and I don't think most of my coaches ever learned my first name, frankly. You know, it was a lot of pushing,
Mhm.
right? Some of them were better than others about that, admittedly. And they were well-intended people.
Yeah.
It's just that um, it wasn't just in sports because I grew up in a middle-class suburb that was upwardly mobile, and it was also everyone should go to Harvard, right? Everyone should make X amount of money. Everyone should move from a small house to a bigger house, from a small car to a bigger car, right? There was this whole orientation of um, you got to make something of yourself. Think about
Mhm.
that phrase, right? Right? As if the universe didn't know what it was doing when you were born, and as if you don't have the same seed in you that that carrot plant had, right? And spiritual teachings are saying essentially, we do have a seed in us of an awakened person, whether we call that Buddha nature or Christ consciousness, or when I was teaching transpersonal psychology, we called it the true self, capital T, capital S, and so forth, right? Um, most of the wisdom traditions have fundamental agreement that we have uh, a dual nature, a human body with a personality that lives in the relative world, so to speak, as it's sometimes called, um, and is vulnerable and is born on a certain day and dies on a certain day, and oftentimes suffers and struggles at times in between, right? Um, and we don't want to bypass that or pretend that that's not the case. At the same time, the beauty of our humanity is that it also includes um, what I would call a natural tendency towards self transcendence. That is, built into us is a capacity to know a different dimension of who we are, right? And that's this dimension of true nature or
Mhm.
Buddha nature or something else, right? And when we begin to experience that, not just conceptually because we read it in a book, but on the level of what teachings call realization, yeah, we start to see the small self, the egoic self, as a subsystem of something much, much vaster, right? And that's where that ultimate mystery comes into play that I got introduced to at 13. And why this learned rabbi who had a lot of life experience and study about spiritual matters could say to me, he didn't understand either why my father died. And and yes, it didn't feel fair to me as a 13-year-old kid,
Mhm.
right? And all he could say was, I don't understand either, in so many words,
Yeah.
right? Um, but that larger dimension of our nature uh, is fundamentally something, as you mentioned a little earlier, the intellect can understand what that is about when we read a good, well-written spiritual book. Um, the process of spiritual maturation involves taking those concepts on the spiritual level as a starting point for a movement toward what teachings call realization, right? So when you realize something, that's an integrated kind of knowing that transforms you in a way that's different than what conceptual knowing can do. However, that doesn't mean conceptual knowing isn't valuable.
Mhm.
It's wonderful. It's often the starting point. When I read that book at 21 about yoga and meditation, a whole new vision of what I was on earth to do took root in me. And all these years later, there's still an essential vision of that sort that rings true to me.
Well, you're right about when you were younger, you always felt intuitively that the things that people were generally valuing, that you didn't find those to be as valuable as they did. But you would kind of had bought in a little bit and would like just kind of like entertain those things. When did you, or I guess how did you allow yourself to follow your intuition more and be, I guess, go against the grain? Like, how did you allow yourself to trust that voice?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with leaving home and going away to college, at which point the influence of that um, middle class environment and school system and the predominant views that I grew up with um, lost a little bit of their grip.
Mhm.
And I started reading and studying and understanding there were lots of other ways to look at the world than to be somewhat addicted to power, money, and fame, essentially, which the culture held up as on a pedestal of some sort.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember when I was in high school, yeah, I was in high school. Um, One of the people who was very well respected in the general community was the father of a couple of friends of mine who was the president of this elite country club that a lot of people aspired to be invited to join. Yeah. Uh, and there was a certain point at which, quite sadly, this man took his own life, committed suicide. Yeah. And that shook the community in an extremely powerful way, even though it was mostly discussed behind closed doors, right? Because this was a man who had attained a lot of the things people were aspiring to attain. You know, had the car and the wealth and the home and the lifestyle that went with the notion of success in our culture, and chose to end his life. Yeah. Um, and it didn't last that long. The community kind of reasserted itself pretty quickly. I didn't. I noticed and continued to notice when I went off to college that um, he had it all, and somehow still felt so unhappy he chose to exit. You know, so in college I studied and I read a lot. I read Jung's autobiography, which I loved, a wonderful book called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I started reading on yoga and meditation. I started practicing quite regularly, and then when I found a teacher, it was like an alternate culture, right? Because material acquisition was not particularly highly valued in a yoga community where people
Hmm.
were aspiring to become conscious, loving, and wise human beings, right? Um, and I've never really looked back. And here again, I'm not anti-material. I think it's wonderful to have the appropriate material level of comfort and to meet our needs and to have the things we need.
Yeah.
Um, I just don't see those as sources of the kind of happiness I'm most interested in.
Hmm.
And I've always found that spiritual teachings speak more directly and effectively to that interest.
Yeah. So how did this path that you started taking at 21 lead into you writing this book about aging?
Well, that's an interesting question. I always liked old people, first of all. You know, when I was young, my maternal grandmother, who was a very simple Russian peasant, um, um, came over to the United States on the boat when she was. I grew up in the Jewish tradition, and because of the pogroms and the persecution, my relatives were chased out of Europe and Russia. Um, and um, she was the only adult in my early life who did not seem to be pushing me in the way we were talking about before. My parents were well intended, and yet they lived in a kind of middle class Jewish subculture in which the common understanding was the way to a better life was education.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of pressure about grades and what college to go to. And there were moments like coming home in sixth grade to talk to my mother about my report card, and which was all A's and a B. Right. The whole conversation was one question. Right. What's this B about? Right. And that's a little bit like what you were saying about your coaches.
Hmm.
Right. Still wasn't good enough.
Right.
Right? Which I interpreted as not lovable. Right. I wasn't being appreciated. I wasn't being seen. All that mattered was my performance. Yeah. Um, so when I hung out with my grandmother, which I enjoyed doing, and she would babysit for my brother and I when we were young, things of that sort. Um, the moment I walked in the room, her face just lit up, right? And sometimes she would say warm, comforting, affectionate things, but a lot of times it was just her presence said to me, "I'm so glad you're alive." And she was so affirming, right? And she seemed to understand the difference between doing and being in a way that most of the people I grew up with didn't, because people were more like human doings, and there was this drivenness,
Yeah.
right? Um, that I found really tiresome, but
Yeah.
everybody seemed to be hypnotized to do that. Not my grandmother. She had a little garden in her backyard. She used to hum to herself when she sort of picked things in the garden. She was relaxed. She seemed pretty happy, and given what she'd experienced in Russia, actually what is now Belarus, um, I could see why she was happy now looking back, right?
Hmm.
So that gave me a sense that there's another way to be. She used to play cards with a group of women, and I would sometimes hang around when they would do that, and find my way to the candy dish on a regular basis, stuff like that, right? um, but that planted a seed. Um, and then also, when I was young, my dad was not the only person who died suddenly and unexpectedly. Um, we had a lot of genetic coronary heart disease in the family. So he had four brothers, all of whom died in a similar manner at pretty young ages. I mean, my dad was 50 when he died. Um, uh, his business partner was one of his older brothers, and his business partner's son died at 49 from a heart attack. And my uncle Irving, who was my dad's business partner, died at a fairly young age, and so forth. Um, and I seem to have some kind of karma associated with people dying, right? One of my closest friends from high school died at 28, and a girl that I dated in high school died at 26. And even though we weren't together when those deaths happened, um, I found myself drawn to hospice work
Mhm.
in my late 20s, partly, I think, to deal with unfinished grief and psychological and emotional business that needed to be addressed. And partly because Ram Dass and Stephen Levine had become two very important teachers to me. Um, and both of them were doing work with dying people. Ram Dass had started a project in about 74, the Hanuman Foundation
Mhm.
Dying Center in Santa Fe. Um, and both Ram Dass and Stephen, at different times, said that of all the different spiritual practices they had done, working with dying people seemed to be the most powerful and transformative. Being at the bedsides, engaging with these people,
Yeah.
in some cases being present when someone physically died, and so forth, right? And that inspired me between my personal history and people who I really respected and whose teaching I trusted. So I started volunteering for hospice when I was in my late 20s. And most of those people that I would work with were elders, right? And there again, I could see how comfortable I was with elders and that they weren't as driven in many cases.
Yeah.
Um, and so I started to do that work, and I saw that in our culture, the reason the hospice movement took off the way it did, which was pretty radical actually, um, was because we didn't honor the spiritual significance of the dying process, and we had medicalized it to
Hmm.
too great of a degree. Too many people were dying in ICUs, or too many people were having their lives extended when they didn't want their lives extended,
Yeah.
and so forth, right? Um, so uh, I could see there was a lot of unnecessary suffering going on in our culture because of our perspective, our view of the dying process. Yeah. Um, so, for example, the first hospice in the United States was in New Haven, Connecticut in 1974, right? Some nurses had gone over to England to a place called St. Christopher's Hospice and observed what was going on. And they came back and they started a hospice in New Haven, Connecticut. Yeah. Um, when I later got involved with hospice work, first as a volunteer and then as a hospice director, first at Ram Dass's Dying Center for a while, and then in Las Cruces, New Mexico, it was 1983, right? So in less than 10 years, yeah, um, the movement went from one hospice in New Haven to, in 1983, when I got hired in Las Cruces, there were 1,300 hospices in various stages of development
That's
in the
crazy.
United States, right? So that tells you it's an idea whose time had come.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So then, if you fast forward to some years later, um, uh, uh, I met a teacher who I talked about in the book, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who most of the students and friends and colleagues would call Reb Zalman. Um, and he was basically saying, we've got the same problem with our view of aging that we had with death and dying.
Right.
Right? That our very perspective, our view, our value stance, and the messaging that we put out in our culture about aging causes an enormous amount of unnecessary psychological and emotional suffering that tragically has a dimension of being a self-fulfilling prophecy to it,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So if you start getting messages from an early age that aging is bad news, it's all about diminishment, and you see people ridiculed because they're older in TV shows
Right.
or in magazine articles or books that you read, and characters are portrayed in a certain way, right? There's a way in which you're likely to grow up fearing aging, right? Understandably so, right? Because you've been told that your life is going to go downhill from anywhere between 39 and 59. You're going to start diminishing, your experience will be one of diminishment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and the fact of the matter is, it's just not true, right? Both in terms of what we see in indigenous cultures, where the elders are considered to be the lineage holders and the wisdom keepers, and the people who can see 7 years into the future what's best for the society or for the community,
Yeah.
because they're not so urgently caught up in paying their mortgage or the immediacy of things.
Right.
Um, um, so uh, I started to see when I met Reb Zalman. He came to Naropa University when I was still on the faculty in the graduate transpersonal psychology program, and we just had an immediate affinity. Um, he was a close friend of Ram Dass, so I'd heard about him quite a bit over the years, uh, and we just really connected. And um, his vision for a number of years had been, we need a new paradigm for aging in this culture. It's time for a paradigm shift. Um, and that, I just resonated with that vision 110%.
Yeah.
And I do to this day, quite honestly.
Yeah.
That's what led me to write the book.
Yeah. You talk about the archetype of the wise elder. So like these principles are kind of your guidebook for doing that in terms of spirituality.
Uh-huh. Yeah, this is one map I wanted to share. I was coming up on 70 when I decided to write the book. And it was somewhat of a bucket list item because I'd never trained as a writer or thought of myself as a writer per se, right? Um, but I had loved books since I was a toddler.
Yeah.
I've been an avid reader my whole life, um, and I realized that there'd been a part of me that wanted to write a book for many years, but I didn't. As an unpublished author, you don't get much of an advance.
Right.
Um, it's not an easy career to make your way into. Um, and I was used to being a stand-up teacher and speaker and presenter, quite comfortable in the realm of teaching directly. Um, and yet there had been this desire to see if I could offer to other people what some of the authors I had benefited from had offered to me. Um, and I was also approaching 70, so that aging was no longer theoretical to me, right? When I met Reb Zalman, I was 45. So I was smack in midlife. We were raising a daughter, my wife and I, um, and I used to apologize when I first started to teach for the Spiritual Eldering Institute, and I'd say, I'm a I'm an elder in training, basically, right? Because most of the people in the room were between, say, 55 and 75, right? Um, but yeah, it just makes sense to me. And I could see that I was fortunate to be able to flush a lot of the negative programming out of my system,
Yeah.
starting at 45 instead of starting later in life. Because that programming goes in deep,
Yeah.
quite deeply, actually. And even when you intellectually can see beyond it, that doesn't mean that those messages aren't still influencing you.
So for the seven principles that you use for this book, just to go over them, we have embracing the mystery, choosing a vision, awakening intuition, committing to inner work, suffering effectively, serving from the heart, and celebrating the journey. How did you come upon these and put these together to provide the structure of the book and the way that you approach conscious aging?
I think it was a combination of uh, life review, as it's sometimes called, looking back at my own experience, uh, and then combining that with my own study of other perspectives of psychological and spiritual development. Uh, and and yeah, really trying to articulate what I had seen myself go through in the process of moving in the direction of becoming an older person who hopefully wasn't just older but was also a bit wiser, right? Um, and so, embracing the mystery, as I mentioned earlier, arose out of that first experience when my father died, um, and I began to see that um, there were constantly aspects of mystery in my life when I looked deeply at what was happening in my life. There was a superficial dimension that the rational mind could make sense of, and that was all fine. And I needed to be able to function on the level of ordinary life and managing a life. However, the deeper meaning of life seemed to be filled with and surrounded by this quality of mystery that's often talked about in the mystical traditions. And it's something that we can only really ultimately know through becoming one with it. That's why in Buddhism we talk a lot about what we call beginner's mind, for example, a mind that's open, that's not so filled with concepts that they determine everything you see and experience and perceive, because you're looking through these light green glasses or whatever it is, right? Um, and and then particularly when I started to work with dying people, doing hospice work, sitting at the bedside of someone, watching someone take a last breath. Um, sure, I understood the biology of a dying physical body. However, the experience of being in a room and watching someone breathe in and breathe out, and feeling this incredible sense of where did they go,
Yeah.
or what just happened, right? What changed?
Yeah.
Yeah, and words were often inadequate, so that there was just a sense of awe and a profound sense of mystery and amazement. Yeah. Um, Likewise, why certain things happen the way they do. Sometimes it made sense, but sometimes it made no sense whatsoever.
Right.
Right? Especially when you're looking into your future from a younger age. One of the tasks of becoming a wiser human being as you age is at some point to begin to look back at your life and see how things connect, how one thing led to the next. And that can sometimes be seen and understood looking back in a way that can't be understood looking forward. Yeah. Um, so the mystery was quite apparent to me. And rather than fearing it or seeing it as an inadequacy in my ability to understand life, I came to see it as a central ingredient in a spiritually oriented life. And that my task was, as I put it in the chapter title, to embrace the mystery and, in a sense, kind of bow to it and open myself to it, and in some ways become one with it, become a statement of it. Yeah. Um, so that naturally led to, so then how do I proceed in my life, right? And that's where this idea of choosing the vision came into play, because I realized there were many different maps or visions I could have chosen for my life,
Yeah.
right? I could have stayed with the vision I grew up with in that upwardly mobile middle class suburb and tried to be a success in, say, the business world, right? And to earn X amount of money or to accumulate certain possessions. That's a vision. May or may not be conscious. Yeah. But I think for people who want to awaken spiritually, being conscious of what vision is guiding their life is really, really helpful. Yeah. And we have different visions that have similar goals and ultimate goals, but if you look at the different religions and the different spiritual paths and forms of practice, you talk about the bodhisattva in Buddhism, and you talk about sainthood in contemplative Christianity, right? You talk about a tzaddik in the Jewish tradition, the Jewish mystical tradition. And um, um, sometimes you just talk about what the Dalai Lama called cultivating a good heart, just being a good human being, right? And most of these visions have to do with actualizing our best human qualities and bringing them to fruition, while at the same time letting our unwholesome and our unwise human qualities atrophy in a certain way. So Thich Nhat Hanh uses the image of watering seeds,
Yeah.
right? Are you going to water the wholesome seeds, the skillful seeds that allow you to be happier and be an instrument of happiness in the world? Or are you going to water the unwholesome seeds of competition and comparison and aggression and wanting to win, meaning somebody has to lose,
Right.
right? Right. Um, so that came naturally, and I saw there were all these different visions, and I developed an early interest in interspiritual studies, right? What used to be called comparative religion. But my passionate interest was, what's the common ground
Yeah.
that all these great authentic wisdom traditions share, right? Um, so so once I recognize that I have to choose a vision, right? How do I choose it? Well, that's where the third chapter came in, awakening intuition, right? It's not a choice like we were talking about earlier that exclusively intellectual. It's a choice that comes from what the Quakers call the still small voice within, a kind of inner guidance principle. Yeah. Um, and intuition is one of the most amazing human capacities I think we have,
Yeah.
frankly. Albert Einstein was famously quoted at one point as saying, I did not discover the fundamental laws of the universe with my rational mind. It was more like he became one with the universe and he saw how it all is.
Yeah.
And then when he came back into his separate small self, he had the gift of intellect to articulate what he had become one with.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Um, so intuition, the only thing that's as amazing to me as intuition in terms of our human capacities is our capacity for self-deception.
Right.
Right. Right. Those two are pretty equally amazing.
Yeah.
And that chapter included a whole section on how to distinguish intuition from self-deception. Because anytime there's desire in our system, we tend to see what we want to be the case, right? There's a famous line in the Tao Te Ching that says, the truth waits for eyes unclouded by longing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a
Um,
really good one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that chapter, just flowed from the previous one. Committing to inner work, once I once I choose a path and a vision, right, then I realize that um, I've got these two parts of myself, one rooted in evolutionary biology, that's all about what I call the alternate trinity, and that's me, myself, and I, right? Um, and the part that wants to wake up, that has this deep spiritual nature we talked about. Um, and so inner work is about just that. It's about being willing to look at ourselves using any of a variety of skillful methods that are available in the best aspects of Western psychology these days, awareness-oriented therapies of different kinds in some cases, and also what the different spiritual practices offer us in the way of tools, or what Buddhists call skillful means,
Yeah.
right? For understanding our motives, knowing when we're coming out of self-absorption or self-interest, and when we're being genuinely altruistic, um, healing our past if we're carrying wounds and unfinishedness from the past, like the work that I did when I got into hospice
Hmm.
to deal with the losses in my personal history. Um, Inner work, yeah. Um, and of course, when we do that inner work, we see where the next chapter came from, which I called effective suffering. As I mentioned in the book, that comes from a phrase that was used by um, Thomas Merton, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, Merton said he wanted to learn to suffer more effectively, and that's why he became a monastic. Yeah, which to most people at first glance sounds completely ludicrous, right? But if we understand that from a spiritual standpoint, suffering is functional, it's not desirable. I wouldn't wish it on myself or you or anybody else, right? But the first noble truth in Buddhism appears to be true,
Yeah.
that if we're born as an incarnate human being, at times we will suffer. Yeah? Um, and those of us who see ourselves as spiritual practitioners choose to see the times as suffering as part of a curriculum for spiritual awakening,
Yeah.
rather than something related to a punishing God or some kind of unfair treatment by the universe. Yeah. Um, so that's the fifth chapter of the seven. Um, the sixth has to do with when we start to learn how to work with our own suffering, we become more compassionate people, right? We become what some people call a wounded healer.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, it wasn't an accident that 20 years after my father died, I was directing a hospice program teaching people about grief, right? Because I had an affinity with that kind of suffering. And no one helped me with that grief much at all when I was young. Most people, well-intended people, extended family members said, um, now you're the man of the family, right? Your job is to take care of your mother. Well, my brother was leaving for college a week after the funeral. I was the only other sibling. I was 13 years old. Nobody seemed to know that I might be grieving, right? Um, so uh, when I met my wife, for example, she was working as a physical therapist. We were living in Kathmandu in Nepal. And she was doing this beautiful work with disabled children's programs for UNICEF and Save the Children and a variety of children's rescue organizations. It was only after I got to know her that I found out she'd had polio as a child. Yeah. And she had a special connection to what it's like to have a brace on your leg, which she had to have for several years when she was very young, and so forth, right? So, um, so then we move into that sixth chapter, which is about serving from the heart. Because if you've suffered effectively and you've become a wounded healer, it's a natural expression of who you are as a person at that point to reach out and try to be of benefit and to alleviate suffering in the world.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, And and I guess the last chapter had emerged out of my more recent life experiences. I called it Celebrating the Journey. Um, and there does seem to be a point in the process at which, um, rather than being on the way to something, right, there's a sense of arriving,
Mhm.
right? We talk a lot about being a spiritual seeker, but we don't talk much about being a spiritual finder,
Yeah, it's a great phrase from the book. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, and I realized as I got older and my life started to feel increasingly workable, and my ability to appreciate both the hard parts and the sweet parts seemed to deepen and become sweeter, that I was simply feeling blessed and privileged to have a human life in the first place. And rather than being on the way, there was some sense of each moment being, this is it, right? This life is not a dress rehearsal, in effect, right? Even though our culture, with its particular view that we talked about earlier, is all about getting from here to there, except there becomes a receding horizon.
right. Yeah.
Like, when do you get there, right? And so that last chapter was really about, um, that I've had the good fortune to sit with some amazing elders, both as a teacher and trainer of conscious aging work and as a student of spiritual teachings. People like Reb Zalman, who I've talked about, you know, died at 88, about 10 or 11 years ago, and Father Thomas Keating, who I had the privilege of meeting in 1981 and staying in connection with until he died at 95 in 2019, um, working with Ram Dass and a couple of his organizations. My primary teacher for 3 years in Nepal was a wonderful Tibetan teacher named Tranggu Rinpoche, who died at
Mhm.
91 this past June. Um, and these people seemed not to be on their way to someplace. They were like my maternal grandmother.
Yeah,
They were just being.
already there.
Yeah, and their doing seemed to emerge naturally out of their being versus the other way around.
Yeah.
So, so that's kind of how the book unfolded. You know, it was looking at my life and also the studies that I had done with other people and the academic work I did in terms of gerontology and my interest in the aging process.
Yeah. Yeah, the book is with me being in college, it's a little ahead of where I am in my life right now, but I always find it interesting to hear these kinds of perspectives on just like these this kind of arc to life that we have. I find very interesting, and I think it can be a big problem trying to cling to youth, and that's something that we're very much, it seems like, encouraged to do. So yeah, it was a pleasure to read, and thanks for putting that together. It's hopefully will help me and others my age a little down the road to keep these kinds of things in mind, which I think getting these kinds of messages now is, I'm making a prediction, but it seems to be pretty useful to have a better perspective on just life in general rather than being like too zoomed in on, I guess, my age and the phase I'm in right now. So I'll have the book linked in the description along with your website. Along with those things, do you have anything that you would like to let people know about?
I don't actually. I'm just getting ready to write another book
Cool.
starting in about a week.
Oh, nice.
And so I'm excited about that. But um, my website has some of the retreats and teaching that I'll be continuing to do. And I do have a couple of weekly online groups that still meet. And there's information about those on my website under Weekly Sangha. And yeah, just happy to have a chance to connect with you. And
Yeah.
maybe we planted some seeds in you that you don't have to buy into all the messages that you're going to
Right.
be getting as you get older about it being bad news, because the truth is it's not. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I'm not Pollyanna about the hard parts. at
Right.
all. I mean, there are hard parts for sure, right? However, it wasn't a piece of cake to be 14 either,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Let's face it, every stage in life has difficult parts and parts to be appreciated, and I think we have the capacity to appreciate each stage of life for what it is, and see the whole thing as a certain kind of mysterious and wonderful blessing that we can learn from and share with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on and being willing to share this message with me and others. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you reached out, Jake.
You too.
So, yeah, thank you again.
Thanks.
Bye bye.